What's up, Soul Family? Coming at you with another collective reading. If you've been looking for messages from your angels, ancestors, guides, deities, then I might have something for you. I also want to let you guys know that for the next week, I'm going to be conducting $20 readings and $25 spells. So feel free to either DM me directly or book through the link in my bio. But that being said, let's jump right into it. And I also want to start by saying I don't think tarot is best used by telling you your future. I think it's best used to kind of guide you through the energies that you're navigating through right now and telling you how to best create your future. So if you are somebody who feels like tarot is something that should be predictive, then this might not be the reading for you. My goal is to empower you to make the proper choices or the best choices that you can make from the standpoint that you're holding or the perspective that you're standing in. So then we have the Moon and the Page of Cups. Okay, so I think a lot of the times when these cards pop up, the Moon card can be pointing towards maybe you're having to navigate through a lot of uncertainty and having to try and use your intuition. And with the Page of Cups, I'd like to believe that maybe you're still a little bit maybe newer to having to trust your intuition and having to navigate through that uncertainty by using such. So maybe there's a level of trying to have to hone in and learn how to navigate through these situations as you're wading through the darkness. And it feels a little bit uncertain because when we're trying to grow a skill, especially something like our intuition, it can be a little bit jarring when we don't see the path in front of us. But with the Page of Cups, it's pointing towards trying to approach it from maybe a little bit more of a curious standpoint versus a, I guess, more rigid and afraid perspective. Whenever I think about the Page of Cups and I think about children, I think about their perspective to things. They approach things from a very new perspective. They approach things from a very fresh lens. So maybe it's calling to approach whatever scenario that you're going through from that viewpoint, from that standpoint of somebody who's a little bit younger and more curious versus closed off and like expecting. Because a lot of times as we get older, we tend to kind of expect the worst versus being open to just, who knows what happens. Like when you're a kid, every day is magical because you just don't know what the fuck is going on in reality. Like reality is just new to you at that point. So I think it's kind of like the energy of, especially when you're trying to trust your intuition, doing the best you can to be open to it, and then even being imaginative to the better aspects of the things that could happen versus imagining and reminiscing on the things that could go wrong. And okay, I'm not far off. The Six of Cups. So the Six of Cups has a lot to do with like childlike energy and nostalgia and looking back on the past. And a lot of times when we're actually able to sit in that energy of like of a childlike perspective, I think one of the cooler stories that I remember from Sadhguru, he's a spiritual teacher, but he was saying how he went to a prison. And long story short, this is a prison full of like the most violent crimes. These are like some hardened criminals. I'm talking about murder and, other heinous acts. And long story short, when they were able to kind of detach from that setting and he gave them a ball, within moments, these were killers, people who harm people and who were in this high like high security prison, right? And within moments they're kicking a ball, they're playing with each other, they're laughing, they're giggling like children. So I guess I'm kind of derailing a little bit, but when we approach things from a different perspective, when we approach things from a little bit more of a curious lens, and we actually are able to sit in the energy of that childlike wonder, it allows paths to open up a little bit easier versus like when we're adults, we tend to think about the worst that's going to happen. We tend to kind of like ruminate and fixate on the past experiences that we've had. And I guess when we're children, we haven't had those past experiences to then be disappointed by, or at least not enough of them to then kind of, defer us from them being optimistic and keeping our vision towards more positive things. So I think it's really important to do our best to, while we go through things, keep our minds focused on that. And I'm not even saying I think it is. It is, because we create reality with our minds, with our intentions, with our beliefs. So the more we keep our minds open and geared towards that, the better things tend to go for us just in general. That's quite literally metaphysics and how manifestation works. All right, I don't want this to be too much of a long reading, so I'm going to pull a couple more and then we'll go from there. Or maybe like one more in the bottom of the deck. The Strength card. So I think a lot of times, like, life tends to kind of harden us. It kind of tends to sometimes create versions of us that are a little bit more rigid, and we tend to have to grow strength through resilience and through all these painful things. And I think that inner child sometimes, because sometimes strength is about having parts of us that are internal, but then we're not exactly showing them externally. And usually it points towards, having the more ferocious side, the more, vicious side that we can kind of like keep tame. However, I'd like to think that in the context of everything that we've been speaking about, it could be pointing towards allowing that tame version of yourself, that inner child, to be free instead of always being that hardened character, having to hold everything in, always having to keep that demeanor of trying to stay focused and trying to, keep everything together. Sometimes it's important to let that inner version of yourself free, that inner child free, those versions of yourself that are soft, free, and out to experience things. It's not always healthy to go through life, and while we always want to use our discernment and keep our walls up when it's necessary, we don't necessarily want to keep those walls up when they're not needed, and when we're able to be soft, when we're able to actually connect to other people or connect to softer energies. And then on the bottom of the deck, we have the Wheel of Fortune. So a lot of times, and this is interesting because Boomy in Avatar, so the Wheel of Fortune in general has a lot to do with, like, we go through things many times because there are so many different structures that we're born into that we don't always have the most, at least inherently before we start to understand how we are able to create things, we don't always have the most control over so many structures. And sometimes we're born into them, and certain cycles then kind of come about through that. Like, not everybody was born into a rich family to be able to kind of escape the cycles of what capitalism might inflict on somebody. So I say this to say that there are ups and downs in our experiences, and what we can always do, even in the worst times, is keep our minds fixated. And I know I'm not saying you can't sit and process things. I'm not saying you're not supposed to feel things. I'm not saying that you're not supposed to allow what we consider to be negative emotions to have their space. But what I am saying is there's a difference between feeling them and then thinking that things will never change and keeping your mind that this is how it's always going to be. This is how this is how it was. This is how it's always going to be. It's never going to change. Versus in that exact same breath thinking, this really fucking sucks, but I know there is better. But I have hope, but I have intentions, but I am moving towards better. And I think that's one of the biggest differences in manifestation, where people tend to think that negative emotions are a bad thing. But negative emotions are a bad thing only if you allow those negative emotions to keep you where you are, not if you allow them to propel you towards what you want, and if you keep in mind the things that you do desire. But going back to what I was kind of getting at with Boomy, Boomy has in Avatar, he has a very different way of seeing things. He always has had a very different approach to everything. Where somebody sees a door, he sees, like, I don't know how to explain it. His mind is fucking crazy. But the point I'm trying to make is where he sees a wall, where other people see a wall, he will see a door. There we go. That was the thing I'm trying to get at. And even in the second version of Avatar, there was Aang's son, who was named after Boomy, and he also had a similar kind of energy, where just a very unconventional point of view, different from everybody else, kind of like marched to the beat of his own drum. But sometimes when we allow ourselves to be in that more wacky headspace, when we allow ourselves to kind of be in that more, because kids are very imaginative. When we allow ourselves to be in that more, imaginative headspace, things tend to work out better for us because we're not like imagining the bad. We're imagining more positive things. We're imagining cooler experiences. And as we are kind of like in that space of creation, because we tend to think that our imagination is just our imagination, but our imagination and our mind is actually where we connect to creation itself. It's where we've always been able to create from it, even if it's been from a subconscious level. That is how manifestation works. So when we're allowing ourselves to keep our minds somewhere else while even the negative things are going, it allows the bad to pass a lot faster, and it allows us to then go into better experiences that much sooner as well. As always, I never intended for this to go on to like 10 minutes, but I never do, and that's just kind of how it goes. But peace and blessings. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the next reading.